Wireless data. It's what connects us to just about everything. And full power licensed spectrum is how it gets from point A to point B. Americans will use 5 times more 5G data by 2027. To make sure all Americans benefit from secure, reliable 5G networks, we need more full power licensed spectrum. Go to more5gspectrum.com to learn more.
If you're listening to this show, you probably like history. If you also like bourbon and want to dive into the history, science, and stories behind the labels, you have to check out Bourbon Pursuit, the official podcast of bourbon. With 3 new episodes every week, you can learn all about the best bottles, the personalities behind your favorite brands, and get the juicy scoop on all things whiskey. For example, I just learned that bourbon is a distinctive product of the United States. It can't be produced anywhere else in the world, kind of like champagne. And no, not all bourbon has to be made in Kentucky either. Join your hosts, Kenny, Ryan, and Fred, on an epic bourbon adventure. Subscribe and follow Bourbon Pursuit wherever you get your podcasts.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Szamotah and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, my friend? How are you?
Chillin', man. As per usual, feel like a little spry today. This is one of the few times in our history of recording the podcast that we did a twofer back-to-back. And
Yes.
Feeling pretty good.
Yes. This episode is going to be most likely released maybe a couple of weeks after we record this. It is April the 10th on Sunday. So we're recording this as a backup, basically. So over the next couple of weeks, both of our calendars are getting pretty crazy. So we anticipate not being able to record an episode. So we're recording this as a backup. So when that time inevitably comes, it could come next week, it could come the week after, we're prepared with an episode. So we don't leave you guys hanging. Because I know sometimes when we miss an episode, people are like, what the fuck, man?
Where's my content,
man? Hey, where's the content, man? We need more.
I mean, the episode is going to be nascent, right? So, who knows what's going to happen in the next few weeks, but this, will have relevancy, I think, for at least a few months. And it has, to do with the Russian-Ukrainian war, at least maybe some of its origin points. So, I think this will work regardless of when we drop it.
Yeah, so we're going to try to aim this to be a little bit more evergreen. And what we're going to talk about today is the Maidan Revolution, the Ukrainian Revolution in 2014. I'm interested just to talk about, what were the events that led to it and, what happened on the ground, because it's a very complicated story, and it is also a huge turning point in history, as it turns out. You could make the argument it signifies the really the origin or the beginning of the current conflict going on. And if you want to look at it in a grander scale, you could say that it is like the origin of the new multipolar world.
Could be.
It's when we've talked about it prior, I don't think we've talked about it with that significant context. But now looking back at it, I think the 2014 change in government, revolution, coup, whatever you want to call it, is just going to be known as a really big turning point in human history. I think along the lines of, maybe I'm speaking too grandiose right now, but along the lines of like Archduke Ferdinand being shot and murdered, and really signifying or leading to the events of World War I. Because
for our sakes, I hope that it turns out to be that you're wrong. Because I really not.
I hope. Yeah, I hope I'm wrong too. And but just like the immediate impact of the 2014 revolution, it led to the immediate Russian annexation of Crimea, the 8-year civil war in Donbass, the heightened tensions between Russia and the West, a domestic political crisis in the U.S. with Russiagate, the eventual impeachment of Trump for withholding aid to Ukraine, But, most importantly, this terrible war that hopefully is over by the time this episode has been released, but I'm not holding my breath. We've talked about this, but just never in that great detail. And there's a lot of different sides of the story. So I wanted to try to present these sides in an objective manner, so people listening can make up their own mind. I know it's kind of impossible to do that because we're not totally objective beings, nor could I present every single side of this revolution because it's just outrageously complicated and there's so many contradictions in the story that at the end of the day, it's still, kind of unconclusive of what happened. On what to think about, the 2014 Euromaidan or Revolution of Dignity. Whose fault was it? Was it an organic protest or was it a U.S.-backed fascist coup? Did Yanukovych deserve to be overthrown? In the past, when talking about the Euromaidan, I have always stated that the U.S. was heavily involved overthrowing Viktor Yanukovych, but I've always just boiled down my evidence down to the leaked phone call from Victoria Nuland speaking to Jeffrey Pyatt about the successor to Yanukovych 2 weeks prior to the revolution happening. She had correctly anticipated the choice of the new prime minister, Yatsenyuk, a.k.a. Yats, that's who she's referring to on the phone call. You can even say that she selected the new prime minister. So I wanted to explore all this. Now, what makes this so complicated to understand is that there's a sharply divergent narratives propagated by Ukraine in the West on one side and then Russia on the other side. In the West, of course, it's called the Revolution of Dignity. The Euromaidan is presented as a democratic and peaceful mass protest movement that overthrew this government led by a puppet of Putin. I have a quote from a historian, Stanislav Byshak, who kind of underlies a lot of the roots of Ukrainian nationalism. And do you want to read this or?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take it. Ukrainian nationalists tend to interpret all facts linked with the history or modern Russian-Ukrainian relations exclusively in the terms of Russian imperialism that seeks to invade, oppress, and enslave tiny Ukraine that has been struggling for independence for centuries. After a referendum and following the return of Crimea into Russia, this myth has significantly strengthened, spreading on a bigger number of formerly apolitical Ukrainians. While it was trendy in Russian politics just a few years ago to accuse the opposition of, quote, working for the U.S. State Department, it is now popular in modern Ukrainian politics to accuse rivals of, quote, working for the Kremlin. For instance, former President, Yushchenko's electoral slogan ran, quote, the only one who is not controlled by the Kremlin.
So let's hit on this. So this is a pro-Russian writer. I'm just going to be transparent, or at least I don't want to say pro-Russian writer, but at least a writer who explores the elements of the right wing in Ukraine. And when I listened or talked to Russians, this is kind of like the narrative or spin I get. Oh, poor, Ukraine just feels sorry for itself. They're always trying to present themselves as a victim. They always say that their excuse for everything is Russian imperialism. This new Ukrainian nationalistic movement is a new phenomenon. They've always been part of Russia, and this movement was propagated by external geopolitical motives, such as the Germans financing and funding the Ukrainian nationalist movement in the early 20th century and so on like that. And now we're kind of seeing a repeat with the United States and the West.
Kind of more importantly, that it was rooted in anti-Russianism rather than, being like an organic thing.
Yeah, exactly. Or anti-Russianism. So I think there's truth on both sides to it. I certainly believe that nationalism is a very powerful force, or when those wheels start turning, when people start to collectively see themselves as one group, usually that is in response to another group they see as an oppressor. I mean, that's like a common origin story of nationalism. And once a group is kind of sees themselves as a group, then it's very hard to tell them that they're not a group.
Right.
You know what I mean? You can't say like, oh, well, you're not a real group. You only existed for 80 years. And I'm no expert on Russian-Ukrainian history, but that seems to be a narrative that would piss people off. Like, you're not a real group. It's like kind of like the Israelis calling the Palestinians not real people.
Yeah.
Like, you're not a real people. You're just Arabs who took the name Palestinian as a way to kind of nationalize your movement, but you guys are just Arabs, part of Jordan and part of Lebanon. You know, you're from different Arab states or nomadic herdsmen who never really saw themselves as Palestinian prior to the Israeli state being formed, and that's when you decided to collectively unite and form these terrorist movements.
I mean, kind of independent of histories, you bring up a really good point, and that's like, who is anyone else to tell someone that they're not a thing? Once they've decided that's kind of that, and in the case of Ukraine and Ukrainian identity, regardless of, the history behind it, and there is a very complicated history of Ukrainian independence and the Ukrainian identity, the case and the reality on the ground is that they're a thing because they say they're a thing, and that's that.
Yeah. Well, it's like saying there's no such thing as American because American only existed, after the 18th century.
There's no American race.
You don't have the same heritage. You don't have the same heritage as someone who has lasted, like a nationality that has lasted the length of time. But the thing is, though, is that almost every nationality is invented in the 19th century.
Right.
If you just look at like the history of nationalism, most states didn't collectively, peoples of a state didn't collectively see themselves as one until these movements of nationalism really kind of ramp up in the late 18th century and the 19th century.
That's what these arguments on the Russian side kind of frustrate me a bit, that when we go down the rabbit hole of like, oh, Ukraine isn't a thing because history, it really begs into question, like, if we use this argument, we can break down a whole lot of people. We can take down a whole lot of nations, like their credibility. So, it's kind of a troubling kind of argument, and it doesn't really hold firm for me, at least.
Well, here's the thing. It's with the war, more and more Russian speakers are sympathizing with they're starting to see themselves as Ukrainian. And I have no doubt it's because of just, the invader-occupier dynamic.
Sure.
Now,
for sure.
So it just complicates things even more, because I guess it was less in 2014. There really were kind of these cleavages that were, I don't want to say clear, but a little bit more binary than they are right now. Now, the major cases of violence, and just going back to the coup or the revolution, the major cases of violence are blamed on the police or agents working for Yanukovych or Russia. That's what the Western narrative is, that it was Yanukovych and or Russian secret agents basically going in there and provoking and causing the violence. But on the other side, the Russians have labeled the Euromaidan a fascist coup. For example, Sergei Lavrov said that the Russian government had evidence that the right sector coordinated sniper shootings during the Maidan protest to create chaos and, to create that pretext to overthrow the government.
Mm-hmm.
And
can you tell us? Sorry, I was just going to ask, like, could you explain who the right sector is? Because I think it's important, for us to all know, like, what that is.
the Right Sector is a Ukrainian fascist political organization that came to existence through a merger of several ultra-nationalist and openly neo-Nazi groups. And these groups they included a group called Trident, a group called White Hammer, Patriots of Ukraine. So a bunch of smaller political organizations who were, sympathetic to real hard right-wing politics, even Nazism in some case. We're talking about not Nazi as in every Republican's a Nazi type of thing. We're talking about like the grandsons of members of the Galatian SS type Nazis who have swastikas, on their license plate or something. Like they're like real not Hitler lovers.
Nazis.
The guy that they tend to worship is Stefan Bandera, who was the head of the Galatian SS, who perpetrated the Holocaust in Ukraine. And so we're talking about some nasty figures right here.
But we're also segmenting them generally from the Ukrainian people who are also involved in the protests that led to this incident.
The Russians also claim that the U.S. government was actively working with the Right Sector to do this. Now, I don't think there is any evidence that the Russian government has released to support this claim. So we don't know. It's possible because, there's evidence that the CIA was working with Ukrainian Nazi types after World War II during the Cold War in the 50s and 60s. So maybe those contacts could have survived, but or at least that kind of that rat line, what you would call it, could have lasted a time. But I think there's no like direct evidence or like declassified documentation that directly links that. I guess you're making that speculation. Maybe there's speculative evidence, but I wouldn't want to make that claim yet, at the very least. In addition, the Russian media often exaggerates the role of the far right during these events. So they'll just do things that they don't need to over-exaggerate it. To the point where you're just like, okay, you didn't really need to over-exaggerate it, and the fact that you over-exaggerated it makes it seem less reliable. For example, they called ordinary protesters neo-Nazis when they were actually just ordinary protesters. Right. They were just saying, the media reports would be like, oh, a bunch of guys, people with red and black flags. The red and black flag meant blood and soil. It was the more, scary flag than the blue, yellow, and why am I forgetting the third color? Blue and yellow. Yeah, there's only two colors. I'm dumb.
Yeah, just two.
The blue and yellow flag.
How could you forget? It's been plastered everywhere.
I know. It's been plastered in everyone's Facebook and Twitter handle. But the red and black flag is like the backdrop of the right sector. They had said there were some contradictions where they said that some protesters at specific times were holding that flag, but they actually did have the blue and yellow one. But I guess that's not really that important. The point is that, of course, they're going to use that as their own political propaganda to justify what they want, their policy agenda to be, because it is a pretty good justification. Hey, like there's some Hitler-loving Nazis over there. Right. We're justified.
We need to go get rid of them.
We need to go get rid of them.
Right. But on the other hand, the exaggeration on that point is that the argument for, or I should say, against the Euromaidans, the Euromaidan being a revolution and rather being a coup, is that they're basically inflating the Nazi aspect of it, because there were in fact Nazis there, but as we'll discuss later, they certainly weren't the first, and they weren't all of them either, not even close, right? But we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah. So on the other side, the Western media and the Ukrainian media, they basically said, no, there was there was like a couple of Nazis, but not really that many. Like they're just totally over exaggerating it. The truth is, it's somewhere in the middle between there's no Nazis and everyone was a Nazi. There was way more than just a couple of Nazis. but there were less than everyone in the protest was actually a Nazi. So it's somewhere in the middle, and you have two forces that are heavily motivated to use propaganda. It's very difficult to find out what's true and what's not true. Mm-hmm. And the way I look at it is that let's just say at the time that I think it was around 2% of the polling voted for the far right groups. That's still like more influential than the Libertarian Party in the United States.
Right.
You know what I mean? So there was a level like that's not. It sounds insignificant, but it's still their power doesn't come necessarily from their numbers, but it comes from just the extreme length they're willing to go to achieve certain goals. Mm-hmm. And despite not being the majority of protesters, they were extremely important in overthrowing the government.
Yep.
For example, on February 5th in 2022, so recently, so just days before the current war broke out, Yevhen Karas, who is a member of the neo-Nazi group C14, he said in a public address, LGBT and foreign embassies say there were not many Nazis at Maidan, maybe about 10% were real ideological ones. If not for those 8% of neo-Nazis, the effectiveness of the Maidan coup would have dropped by 90%. The 2014 Maidan Revolution of Dignity would have been a gay parade if not for us. He then went on to say that the West armed Ukrainian ultranationalists because, in his words, so this is a Ukrainian nationalist talking, saying, hey, yeah, we were a small number. We may have been 8% of the protest, but we were the hammer because we have fun killing. Direct quote. So there was clear advantages of working with the far right in the Euromaidan protests because they're willing to do violence to achieve their goals. And, there's many testimonies and footage to support this. So, again, like the question is, where does the truth lie?
Yep. Kind of before we get into that, I wanted to flesh out a little bit. This part kind of caught my eye when I was reading through, your notes and doing my own research, is the part that the LGBT activists were, what they played in this initial revolution. And I found that really fascinating. So I pulled an article from Cornell International Affairs Review, and it's called "A Silent Dissonance: LGBT Rights and Geopolitics in the Maidan and Post-Maidan Ukraine." And I found this, it was written in 2016, and I found it really interesting because I wasn't aware of, the situation for LGBTQ communities in Ukraine and how that even had a role at all in this conflict. And I'll just kind of summarize a little bit for you. So, some history that they bring up is that in 91, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine made some history by becoming the first post-Soviet country to decriminalize homosexuality, which is pretty crazy, because generally speaking, the USSR was pretty homophobic in general, and frankly, so was most of the world. And 91 is pretty early on that front. But other than this achievement, the conditions for the gay community in Ukraine have been, at a low point for many years. They have suffered violent attacks, against their population in many years, and I think the reason why it was kind of allowed to happen was because there was no article in the Ukrainian criminal code on hate crimes committed on the basis of sexual orientation, right? So these were just regular crimes, and so were prosecuted as such. And Yanukovych, their government, they basically completed a deal with the former prime minister, Tymoshenko, and they were helping to negotiate with the European Union to join the European Union, but Ukraine had to meet certain criteria requirements, and one of those requirements was actually an anti-discrimination bill that should have been implemented in Ukraine, which would have finally protected the LGBT community, in Ukraine, under these strict federal but also international laws. And what's interesting about that is that, there was this big propaganda machine, that was mostly fueled by the Kremlin in this case in Ukraine, that was going against the EU bid. And a lot of the argument, or at least some of it, hinged on this idea that joining the EU is going to turn Ukraine gay, and there were still a lot of people who were very homophobic, in this political climate. And, they started using this as a wedge issue. They pretty successfully weaponized the gay rights issue and, turned it against the process of European integration. And, what I find interesting there is that I wonder out loud to myself, and this is something I'm curious about your point too. Was it that Ukraine or Russia generally was super homophobic and that's why they opposed this? Or was this just kind of a neat little issue that they can use, for their overall policy objectives, which is, preventing a Ukrainian alignment with the EU?
I would imagine that most people in Ukraine, despite whether they're pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian, are probably not necessarily tolerant of gays, and that's probably why it was used. But pulling this back, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had very strong regional political cleavages. Western Ukrainian regions have generally voted for pro-nationalist parties and favored the independence of Ukraine from the Soviet Union and Russia. But in contrast, many Eastern regions have often backed pro-communist and pro-Russian parties. For example, in 2004, presidential elections during the Orange Revolution, this was the second election because the first election was allegedly fraudulent. Viktor Yushchenko, the pro-Western candidate supported by nationalist parties, received more than 90% of the votes in Western Ukrainian regions compared to less than 25% in Eastern Ukrainian regions. Now, Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian candidate or the neutral candidate, however you want to define him, there's arguments for both, received more than 70% of the votes in Eastern Ukraine and less than 7% in the Western Ukrainian regions. So there's like these very clear regional differences or regional voting patterns, even more so than a place like the United States, where a lot of people kind of boil down like, oh, the North is blue state and the South is red state. I mean, that's a very binary way to sum it up, but it's kind of generally true. But there's obviously differences. In Ukraine at that time, there were these clear differences in voting patterns depending on what part of the country you lived in, and most studies of voting patterns in Ukraine attribute regional differences to ethnic language differences. There's this huge debate over the way that geography intersects with political attitudes and behavior in Ukraine. Most scholars, what they suggest that reasonably, well-defined geographic divides, they do exist. Others suggest, though, it's a lot more complicated than just regional divisions, which, again, I'm sure it's true. But if you take it at face value that geographic divides do exist, the next step is to consider how that impacts political behavior. I read this this real interesting study by this Ivan Kachanovsky, who links the regional cleavages in Ukraine to differences in political culture. And to be more specific, he was linking them to these very distinct historical and religious legacies. So when we say the term like regional political culture, it refers to values and norms that are shared by many residents of a particular region. So this can be something like, just like a shared history or a shared gripe within a region. Like there's different political cultures across the United States. There's a different political culture. In the United States, it's not really state by state, but it's
community by community even.
It's community by community, but I think the easiest way to see the breakdown, the voting patterns is rural district by urban district.
China is making 370% more 5G spectrum available than America. Tell Congress to restore FCC auction authority and allocate more 5G spectrum to make sure America leads the industries and innovations of the future. Go to more5gspectrum.com to learn more.
Urban areas tend to vote Democrat, and rural areas tend to vote Republican. That's like the easiest way to break down the cleavages. Then there's demographics as well. You can see voting patterns by, gender, by race, by education. There's these different
religion
statistics. By religion. When political scientists they examine this, these are the types of things that they're finding. And these.
Well, I mean, it's the reason why you see these. A lot of the campaigns will reach out to these very niche, communities in crazy places all over the country to garner the support, because they'll find, for example, there might be a substantial population of Jewish people in Brooklyn or something like that, and they'll shape their political outreach around those issues surrounding that community to garner support for their candidate. Meanwhile, they'll turn to a completely different side of the country where, you might find a completely different community with absolutely different priorities and opinions, and they'll shape their political messaging to meet that particular area. So, I mean, you're onto something in the sense that, like, sometimes we do vote based on things like race or religion or specific region that we live in, and it's just kind of the political reality. And you see the evidence of that in voting, but also the evidence in that in the way that politicians campaign.
Yeah, for an example would be if you look at like Republican primaries, one of the big groups that they cater to are Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn, because that's the only conservative voting bloc in New York, basically, right, is the Orthodox Jews. So you'll see a bunch of Republicans going down there talking about how much we're going to support Israel.
I mean, at the same time, they'll go down to Florida and pander to the Cuban
yeah, exactly.
Republicans.
Like,
we totally different group of people, right, with different priorities. So yeah.
We're tough on socialism and communism. We know that you love America and came seeking freedom. That's the way that you tailor it. But these, just going back to like how political culture is shaped, it's transmitted by socialization with family, school, religion, and it's transmitted from one generation to another. The thing is, Ukraine includes regions that have belonged to different states for significant periods of time. The Lviv region, the Ternopil region, were part of Galicia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy from 1772 to World War I. These regions became part of Poland until the Soviet Nazi Pact of 1939. There's the Przemysty region, which was ruled by the Habsburg Empire from 1774 to World War I, and then by Romania in World War II. And then there is Transparthia, which belonged to the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until World War I, and then to Czechoslovakia until World War II. And there's also the Volyn region and the Ravine region, both parts of Volhynia province. It belonged to Poland in the periods between the two world wars. all these regions, which collectively are referred to as Western Ukraine, were incorporated into the Soviet Union as a result of the Soviet-Nazi Pact of 1939 and World War II. Now, in contrast, regions of historically Eastern Ukraine were ruled by the Russian Empire from the end of the 18th century, and then by the Soviet Union. And then also take note that the interruptions of Russian and Soviet rule in Eastern Ukraine were very brief. So these territorial divisions helped create these different national identities. Now, it's also important to note nationalism is a relatively new phenomenon. We said this earlier, but it didn't really start spreading until the late 18th century. So there's a really great book, and I would recommend reading it. It's by Shlomo Sand, who's an Israeli historian, and he writes that most of the agrarian societies that preceded the rise of modern society in the 18th century Europe developed statewide supercultures that influenced their surroundings and gave rise to various collective identities among the elite. Yet, in contrast to the image that a good many history books continue to peddle, these monarchies, principalities, and grand empires never sought to involve all the people in their administration of superculture. They neither needed such participation nor possessed the necessary technology with which to foster it. The peasants, the absolute monarchy, and the pre-modern world were illiterate and continued to reproduce their local unlettered cultures without hindrance.
That's pretty interesting, man. It sounds like it makes sense to me, and it also just complicates the issue of national identity, generally speaking, because when we're talking about arguments like against a Ukrainian identity, and they'll say, well, it was owned by this country or that regime or this kingdom or that empire, et cetera, so on and so forth. The reality, at least that Shlomo Sand points out, is that sure, those places were owned by those countries, but the impacts of their influence on the culture and the language really was not as pervasive throughout the entire region as one would suggest, right? So, sure, in the big city or near what he calls the political center, that connection was very strong. The language was very close to the central administration. The culture was probably impacted and shaped by those parties. But out in the fields, they were doing their own thing, So, it kind of brings up this idea that national identity, at least as we see it in this post, in the 18th century plus, time period, it's the people who have the control over particular regions had less to do with the national identity as we know it today than what is suggested or what is used to make arguments for or against the validity of a nationhood or of a cultural identity.
Yeah. And what he's essentially saying is that prior to the rise of nationalism, local religious and status-based identities were dominant among the various people in a country, and that applies to pretty much every country. Their local cultural identity was the more dominant factor in who they were. So there wasn't, there was no. Here's an example I use every time we speak about nationalism. But if you went back in time to somewhere in the 1400s or 1500s and you talked about the United Nations, they really would have zero clue what you're talking about because they wouldn't understand the concept really of a nation. Of one, country and nation weren't really synonymous with one. Because when you say nation, you're really just talking about community. That's what a nation is. There's the Rutgers Nation, I'm sure. There's there's Steelers Nation. There's Ravens Nation. There's the nation really just refers to the collective group, and the nation state is just the collective is the state ruled by that identity.
Right.
So
The collection of people, the community of people in a distinct or sometimes not distinct geographic boundary. Yeah.
And when you go back in time, the reason why there wasn't these movements, these nationalistic movements, why they're relatively new is just because of technology. It's because prior to the 18th century, most people were illiterate. So there wasn't this mechanism or this way to really transmit like these the shared history to each other, the shared culture to each other,
or the idea of a national identity.
The idea, because it takes a lot of work to create a nation. It takes a lot of academic work. You really have to like sit down and write stories and write a history and
spread those stories,
media on your side, and then spread all that to all these different people. So they're like, oh, okay, we're all part of this great nation.
Yeah.
And it requires a literate population to do that. It requires a somewhat educated population to do that, to get them all involved in the fold. And you didn't really start seeing that until the 19th century. So that's why nationalism was a late phenomenon, why it's relatively new. Because prior to that, civilization just didn't have the mechanisms to mass assimilate people. There's nationalists in America, but everyone's a different ethnic group, really, or they can trace their old country, to different places in Europe or South America,
all over the world at this
really
point,
wherever.
Yeah.
All over the world. Like, there's what makes you American is not, well, what's supposed to make you American. I think different people have different concepts of what American is, but what's supposed to make you American is like the love of liberty and the common language and the shared admiration for the founding fathers and all that stuff. And I mean, I guess people do have different concepts of what American is, but relatively speaking, I think those are the shared stories that we have. The liberators of France in World War II, Declaration of Independence, America. Just name the song "America Fuck Yeah."
Yeah.
Just name all the things in America Fuck Yeah, and that's the American identity.
Well, I mean that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, video.
That's one way
baseball.
To look at it. I think more importantly, and this is something that just dawned on me, really is the collective agreement, that to be assimilated sometimes can be forceful, but what that doesn't necessarily make a strong national identity. What makes a strong national identity is a bunch of people agreeing that they are a thing, right? And what it comes down to is the difference between like being a subject of a central authority like a government or a dynasty or an empire. Like you can be the subject of the Roman Empire out in God knows where, but it doesn't necessarily make you feel like, yeah, I'm Roman. You know what I mean? But
yeah.
The difference with nationhood and national identity is that Roman, I know Rome doesn't exist anymore, but that Roman would have to agree like, yeah, I'm Roman and I have a shared experience with other Romans no matter where they are. And I agree. That's my thing, I say so because I say so, because everyone else says so, right? It's this tacit approval that is necessary to make it strong and to make it a thing.
Yeah, and a case study that some historians use is Macedonia. That was like the first nation state. I'm sure there's other case studies too that I'm missing, but I know that's one, at least in Europe, that they're like, oh, that was like that actually had close characteristics of what a nation is. Macedonia, the Greek. I guess they didn't really consider themselves Greek, but the
that's
country
kind of the point,
of Alexander,
right? They considered themselves different, right?
They considered themselves
Macedonia.
something outside of Greek, and it was something else. It was something between barbarian society and Greek society. They had their own like military identity of like using cavalry and stuff, and instead of like being totally reliant on the phalanx, and They, they had their own language, or at least their own dialect, that was used to kind of unite this real strong professional army to take over and conquer Greece and pretty much everywhere from Greece to India.
Yeah.
Now, but that's something that obviously deserves its more like scrutiny and like academic study. But that's just an argument that I've heard, that they had the characteristics of the nation state before modern history started. Now, where was I talking about? Okay,
so we just talked all about the western side of Ukraine and kind of the breakdown of, maybe we can talk about the eastern side because it's different.
Yeah. So one more thing. The reason why these systems developed, the West and East, they developed differently, is because there was a more democratic political system in the Austro-Hungarian Empire compared to that in the Russian Empire. And it gave Western Ukrainian intellectuals more opportunity to spread their ideas and to cultivate a national identity. In contrast, the Russian Empire was much more strict on Ukrainian regional autonomy. They prohibited the activity of Ukrainian political organizations and associations, and they restricted the use of Ukrainian language in education and print. So another thing is the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Galatia played a significant role in the development of Ukrainian national identity, in contrast to the Orthodox Church in the Ukrainian regions of the Russian Empire, because the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is like seen as a branch of just the Russian patriarch. So the Greek Catholic Church is obviously different from the Orthodox Church, where the Western Ukrainians are largely Greek Catholic. But the Russian Empire treated Ukrainians as a regional group, and the Ukrainian language as a rural dialect of Russian. It was called Sarjuk. And it's important to note that the communist political system was not established in Western Ukraine until 1939, until after World War II, really. So Soviet totalitarian policies aimed at significantly reducing or eliminating regional differences, they actually backfire. And it actually, fostered this distinct political culture in Western regions, because in contrast to other institutions, the family outside of direct Soviet control, generations born before Western Ukraine became under the Soviet rule, continued to influence political socialization of the generation born in the Soviet times. So
again, that's another example of Soviets might have laid claim to the land, but in the West, which is far from the political center of Moscow, they were doing their own thing.
Yes, it's exactly. Now, I have a book, so I got a quote from a very pro-Ukraine writer, and it's from a book called "Ukraine: What Everyone Needs to Know." And the quote reads, "Rather than being a Russian region of Ukraine, the Donbass is a Soviet..." So just to give some context, he's talking about the Donbass region and why in 2014 there was a very pro-Russian sentiment, and why they eventually formed into these two autonomous zones. And this was an interesting quote that I had never really considered. Rather than being a Russian region of Ukraine, the Donbass is a Soviet industrial region uncertain of its place in the new Ukraine. Originally migrants from Russia or Ukrainian peasants assimilated by Russophone factory life, Donbass workers identified with the glory of their Soviet-built but now inefficient mines and smokestack industries. Major battles took place in the Donbass during World War II as both Hitler and Stalin coveted the area's coal and steel. Post-war reconstruction soon reestablished the Donbass as a major Soviet industrial region, complete with the attendant mythology of heroic miners who always answered a party's call to labor in defense of the motherland. In other words, the Soviet authorities were rebuilding the Donbass as a model Soviet land at the very time when they were treating any manifestation of Ukrainian identity as suspect. The atmosphere was ripe for assimilation. Not all new workers in post-war Donbass were newcomers from Russia. Some came from solidly Ukrainian-speaking provinces, but the workplace culture gradually molded them into Russian speakers.
Okay, so that's kind of another example, but in the contrary, there was this region in the Donbass was important, and so the Soviets and then later Russia had a vested interest in building it up. It was it was the industrial center, so to speak, right? And both the importation of actual Russians plus the assimilation of Ukrainians who lived and worked there created a different culture.
But what this does, it highlights the complexity of the issue. See, I had never. So what he's basically saying is that these people were Ukrainians, but what happened is that there wasn't really a strong national identity because these people lived in the Russian Empire and never developed that Ukrainian heritage, and the workforce culture that the Soviets implemented was just too strong, where these people assimilated, even Ukrainian speakers assimilated into the workforce culture, and they had this pride of the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union had won these battles during World War II, and there's this whole mythology behind them expelling the Nazis, and that's where these Russian speakers and these Russian leaning or these rebels, where their origin story comes from. Their admiration for the Soviet culture of the old days and how great it was. And another thing to take note is that I just lost my train of thought. I was going to say something important. Oh yeah, so something I noticed was that I've noticed that a lot of Donbass rebels are communist. More than I thought. They're card-carrying communist. And I think that probably stems from that identity, that workforce culture of the good old days.
And honestly, that proximity to the Russian center of the Russian political center.
Yeah.
Being in the east, they're closer to Moscow than, say, Lviv was, right? So it's kind of like in New Jersey, right? I like talking about New Jersey. New Jersey is a small state, but it's a big state. And, the people that live in northern New Jersey are heavily influenced by, New York culture and sports and the New York economy, right? Whereas people in the south of New Jersey are more influenced by Philadelphia and Philadelphia sports and Philadelphia economy, right? Nevertheless, all New Jerseyans have a national or a state identity of being from New Jersey. You can kind of see a pretty clear divide in New Jersey of the two New Jerseys, north and south, in terms of their political, or I guess political would be it, but more like cultural divide, right? And it is pretty stark. So it's a matter of proximity to political centers in the case of geopolitics. And in the case of New Jersey, it's a matter of proximity to sports powers.
Yeah. Well, people up in they're Yankee fans and Met fans up in northern Jersey, and then there's Philly fans down in South Jersey, or there's Eagles fans in South Jersey, and then there's Giants and Jets fans in North Jersey.
That's right.
So it's that it's just what metropolitan center that you're closer to make it as simple as that. Even
thinking about it out loud,
different.
New Jersey really is like Ukraine in that respect. They're kind of the borderlands between those two major centers, population centers, to be honest.
Yeah, and there's no major city in New Jersey.
No,
there's cities in New Jersey, but there's
plenty of major cities. There's plenty of major cities. New Jersey has the highest population density in the country.
But there's
some of their
not a
cities
city.
are much bigger than other states.
Yeah, but there's no city like Philadelphia and New York City are both the top 10. New York's the largest city in America, and then Philadelphia is like the fifth largest city in America, or sixth, something like that. They're one of the larger cities in the country.
Sure, but don't sleep on Jersey because their cities are bigger than most states' biggest cities.
All right,
by a lot
compared to the metropolitan areas that we're talking about right now, that influence.
Yeah, they just happen to be stuck between two really big ones. Yeah.
Is that okay? So let's talk about Viktor Yanukovych, who was the president who was ousted in 2014. Yanukovych was a corrupt guy. He was kind of like, kind of this buffoonish character. Despite his leadership defects and character flaws, Yanukovych had been duly elected. And international observers considered his election to be free and fair. Ironically, Yanukovych, he achieved something democratically that he couldn't achieve through alleged fraud in 2004, because Yanukovych was running, and then his election was, he won the presidential election, and then observers said no, they cheated, and then they did another election, and then he lost. They said, foreign monitors from Europe and the U.S. said that the presidential election in Ukraine between Yanukovych and Yushchenko had these irregularities, and people say that's a coup. But Yanukovych, he wins in 2010, and then he wins because during the Yushchenko years, the country was hit hard by the global financial crisis that began in 2007, and by 2009, Ukraine's GDP had declined by 15%. And Yushchenko, they were corrupt too, so people just were like, "Oh, we have enough of you." And after the election in 2010, when Yanukovych was in power, he was also very corrupt. He used his patronage and other instruments of the state to enrich members of his party, the Party of Regents, and the corruption did alienate a large portion of Ukraine's population. And as the Ukrainian economy fell further behind those of countries like Poland and other East European neighbors, public anger at Yanukovych, it mounted. And Ukraine is a well-educated and resource-rich country. It should be wealthy, but it's always been among the poorest countries in Europe. Ukraine went through a lot of the same things that Russia did after the fall of the Soviet Union. They had, a handful of oligarchs kind of ransack and pillage the country of all its former state assets, where they had this wealthy, rich, this super billionaire class, and then everyone else who was poor. So, and their leaders had just been kind of salesmen, just selling off their natural resources and things like that. So they've been screwed for a long time. What led to his ousting was his rejection of the European Union's terms for an association agreement in late 2013 in favor of a Russian offer. That was the last straw for many young liberal Ukrainians.
Yep.
This
kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about the LGBTQ communities, those activists were among the original Maidan protesters, who helped kind of kick off the Maidan protests in general, in part because of their, anger towards, not towards Yanukovych not wanting to move towards the West, or specifically, an association program with Europe, because that was for them critical to their survival. They wanted to live peacefully and freely in Ukraine, and this was a community that had a vested interest in making sure that they went towards Europe. Yeah,
and it makes sense. It's the West is more tolerant of that. So the story goes, Ukraine was suffering an economic crisis. And in November 2013, the European Union offered to bail out Ukraine and integrate them further into the West. Yanukovych was about to sign the agreement, but Putin bullied and bribed him into rejecting it. Thus began Kiev's maiden protest and all that has followed. Now, that's kind of the story that we're given, but the reality is that it's a lot more complicated. The EU proposal required the Ukrainian government to enact these harsh austerity measures and would have sharply curtailed its economic relations with Russia. It also included protocols requiring Ukraine to adhere to Europe's military and security policies, which meant, in effect, without mentioning the alliance, being a quasi-NATO state. You know, when you think about this was a provocation compelling the elected president of a deeply divided country to choose between Russia and the West. Mm-hmm. And when Yanukovych showed up to sign this agreement, he said that he felt like he felt like a bride to be greeted on her wedding day with a prenup. That was the word he said. He's like, yeah, I feel like a bride on my wedding day being greeted with a prenup.
And the prenup being the austerity measures.
Yeah, because they were still trading with Russia. Yanukovych had he was trying to play this neutral card between the West and the East at this time, and he wasn't exactly like super pro-Putin. He was pro-Putin compared to the other members of the government. But at this time, we're talking about a country that put Yanukovych in power, who voted for him in a free election. So there was this, I don't want to say pro-Russian, but at least this sentiment to put someone who's more even-handed between the West and Russia. Now, what Putin did, Putin proposed a tripartite agreement, including Russia, and the EU in Washington refused to sign it, and then the crisis erupted when Yanukovych asked for more time to consider the EU's financial terms. So, that's kind of the origin story. Ukraine is a very divided country, and they were put in a position where they had to choose between the EU and Russia, and when they chose incorrectly, one side of the government was overthrown, or the government was overthrown. Now, the idea that Ukraine is Europe rather than Russia is very important to understand to make sense of the events of the Euromaidan. Because there was clear support from the West. Because by the beginning of the Euromaidan, Ukraine had a lot of foreign offices which influenced civil society and institutions in Ukraine. The major financial support of these Western projects had been arranged through the channels of the U.S. Agency for International Development, the USIA, and then Freedom House. Freedom House is a nonprofit, U.S. government-funded organization that conducts, research and advocacy on democracy and things like human rights. These are groups that are supposed to promote things like democracy in foreign countries, but they also have a significant amount of power in these countries because they also control aid spigots. So they have the ability to fund different organizations and create these political connections. Then there's groups like the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, which had been working in Ukraine since 1992. And, these Western offices were attached to all stages of the electoral process in Ukraine. And it's not surprising that the formation of pro-Western NGOs was also accompanied by attempts to integrate the entire state into this Western political structure. And the process never really stopped after Yanukovych was elected in 2010. One of the first things that, Yanukovych was the one who was negotiating this association agreement. And Yanukovych famously was being counseled by a Western political consultant to reshape his image, Paul Manafort. So he wasn't exact. I think it's kind of binary to just say, oh, Yanukovych was this, pro-Russian stooge. I think he was just more of a pro-enrich himself stooge, trying to figure out the best plan for himself and to enrich his cronies. I think that's what most evidence points to, rather than being a, really deeply aligned with one side or the other. But I mean, regardless, I understand why people would be fed up with that kind of political leader, someone who's playing, who's using the government as an ATM machine. Usually is not very popular, especially when the corruption is so transparent. But for Ukraine to integrate with the West, it had to at least resemble a modern European country. Mm-hmm. And the EU, and you mentioned this earlier, the EU put forward a list of, I think it was like 19 steps to meet in order to be allowed to sign the association agreement.
Right.
And this included things like, improving electoral laws, and then reforming the police, and then reforming the judicial system. It was called Euro integration. And I think as time went on, they ended up like canceling those things. Like, okay, you don't need to do that. You don't need to do that. Like, you just need to do, we know you're not going to be able to achieve that. But in contrast, the deal with Russia was much more straightforward. It was just like an economic deal. It's like, you want money? Okay, we'll just give you money to help you do this. And then the association deal was actually a loan. So it was the Russian deal was better, to be completely honest, at least a lot better for the government. And when the Euromaidan begins, a lot of weird things start to happen. Like, one of the weirdest things is that new media companies started to appear out of nowhere to encourage people to get out into the streets and start protesting the government. So, like, imagine if there was like, a mass protest movement here. And I mean, there have been mass protest movements in America in the past couple of years. But adjacent to that, there were new media networks that just popped up out of nowhere that encouraged people to go out and protest that and join that protest.
Well, I mean, it kind of already happened. Just instead of media companies, it's social media companies.
Yeah, but it's where did people get the money to do that? Like, where did that all come from? Like these new media networks and broadcast stations mm-hmm. that were encouraging people to join the protest. And then, nationalist groups started showing up to the protest and essentially started acting as shock troops. So the professor that I had mentioned before, I had read a quote of his earlier about some of the cleavages or a paper that he wrote. He wrote another paper. He's this Canadian political scientist. And he wrote this paper about the right sector. And he concludes in this paper that right sector staged a false flag sniper attack on protesters to create chaotic violence. And I don't know. I have wrote some of it down. Do you want me to go through this, or do you want to go through this?
It's kind of long, but I'll start, and then we can pause in between to talk about it, I guess. All right. So it says that the paper analyzes a large amount of evidence from different publicly available sources concerning the massacre and killings of specific protesters. Qualitative content analysis includes the following data: about 1,500 videos, recordings of live internet and TV broadcasts in mass media and social media in different countries, some 150 gigabytes, news reports and social media posts by more than 100 journalists covering the massacre from Kiev, some 5,000 photos, and nearly 30 gigabytes of publicly available radio intercepts of snipers and commanders from the Special Alpha Unit of the Security Service of Ukraine and internal troops and Maidan massacre trial recordings. The study also employs a field of research on the massacre. Can you not highlight that? I can't see it. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
The study also employs field research on the site of the massacre, eyewitness reports by both Maidan protesters and government special unit commanders, statements by both the former and current government officials, estimates of approximate ballistic trajectories, bullets, and weapons used, and type of wound among both protesters and the police. The study establishes a precise timeline for the various events of the massacre, the locations of both the shooters and the government snipers, and the specific timeline and location of nearly 50 protesters' death. It also briefly analyzes other major cases of violence during and after the Euromaidan. The study includes 2 video appendixes. The academic investigation concludes that the massacre was a false flag operation which was rationally planned and carried out with the goal of overthrow of the government and seizure of power. Okay, so quick pause. It's basically saying, look at all this evidence, right? We looked at a ton of shit, videos, radio intercepts, pictures, contemporaneous tweets from journalists, all kinds of stuff. And they're coming to the conclusion that this was a false flag operation, which is kind of wild because there's so much evidence that they're allegedly putting forward here.
Yeah, so I'll link the study. The study has the study is from what I've seen, it seems to hold water. Like they really do have just hundreds and hundreds of testimonies from different people saying like the bullets came from these, the snipers were located here, and it seems from what I'm convinced that this is true. Like that it was the right sector that was shooting people to throw people into a panic and really just to get people more violent. Because if you look at the history of the right sector and their just like their influence and their influence was growing a lot, and they were getting more radical, throughout those years. So there is, when Russia says that there's Nazi fascists in Ukraine, they may be exaggerating it, but it's not made up.
Wrong.
They exist, and it's just you got to look at, if you just look at like the war or just like the mainstream broadcasting. I mean, there's a lot of times where like these groups are just broadcasted on like CNN. Well, you'll get someone who just says something nuts.
Yeah.
Or there'll be a swastika somewhere.
Yeah.
Just like hanging out, or a black sun somewhere, and you're just like, huh? So
let's read a bit more because there's some interesting stuff going on here. Okay, so he writes, the study found various evidence of involvement of an alliance of the far-right organizations, specifically the Right Sector and Svoboda, and oligarchic parties such as Fatherland. Concealed shooters and spotters were located in at least 20 Maidan-controlled buildings or areas. The various evidence that the protesters were killed from these locations, including some 70 testimonies, primarily by Maidan protesters, several videos of snipers targeting protesters from these buildings, comparisons of the position of the specific protesters at the time of their killing and their entry wounds, and bullet impact signs. Wow. So they're going straight like CSI on this, and they're like really, really looking into it. So it says, the study uncovered various videos and photos of armed Maidan snipers and spotters in many of these buildings. The paper presents implications of these findings in the understanding of the nature of the change in the government of Ukraine and civil war in Donbass, Russian military intervention in Crimea and in Donbass, and an international conflict between the West and Russia over Ukraine. The Euromaidan and the change of the government were generally represented in academic studies as a popular movement, which were turned into a revolution and which was motivated by political protest against the authoritarian government, especially its reliance on violence and by support of integration of Ukraine into the European Union. Many scholars also attributed the violent attacks of the presidential administration and the parliament as a response to the government's violence and political repressions, or as a provocations by the Yanukovych government or Russia. They regarded the role of the far-right organizations during the Maidan as insignificant or marginal. Killings of Armenian, Georgian, Jewish, and Polish protesters, and the presence of the right sector during the funeral of Alexander Sherbanyuk, a Jewish protester, were mentioned in about a dozen stories in major U.S., Israeli, and Scandinavian media as an evidence of the diversity of the protesters, their massacre by the government snipers, and tolerant or moderate nature of the right sector, an alliance of radical nationalist and neo-Nazi organizations. The Maidan-led government used the Maidan massacre as a source of its legitimacy and widely commemorated this mass killing and its victims among the protesters. The killed protesters were posthumously awarded the Hero of Ukraine titles by President Petro Poroshenko, and the government established February 20th as a day in their honor. A large group of investigators was specifically tasked with solving this massacre's case, and their investigation involved the interrogations of more than 2,000 people and more than 1,000 ballistic, medical, and other expert reports. Therefore, it appears irrational that the government investigation for a year and a half since the massacre failed to reveal much of basic evidence and to bring any convictions in such a crucial case. Okay, let's talk about that. That's a lot of stuff. What do you think? What are your thoughts?
So, first and foremost, the big contradiction right now is that when people say, like, hey, you can't say that there's neo-Nazis in Ukraine, Zelensky is Jewish. That's true. Zelensky is Jewish. And Kolomoisky, the chief backer of these Nazis, these groups, is also Jewish. So there's a clear contradiction right here that's kind of hard to digest. Igor Kolomoisky is a Ukrainian oligarch. He, is the main financier of the Azov battalion. So there's a lot of these contradictions, and I actually read this interview from this It was an interview with like a Russia advisor to Putin and an advisor to Yeltsin prior. And he was, kind of making the claim, the justification for the war. And one of the questions asked to him was like, how do you keep on saying denazification, but how do you say denazification when the president is Jewish? And he was like, hey, that's because this president, these Nazis their primary goal is to kill Russians. Like that's what their primary gripe is about. And also to add, the Svoboda Party is wildly anti-Semitic as well. They were founded in 1991 as the Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine. Social National Party of Ukraine.
National Social. Yeah.
Wink, wink.
It's Nazi wink, backwards. Tzinoz.
Yeah. They idolized Stefan Bandera, who fought with the Nazis during World War II, and he's a national hero in Ukraine. And you kind of get it. Like he actually, he did kind of turn on the Nazis later in his career, but he still perpetrated the Holocaust. And he was a founder of the OUN, which was the ultranationalist movement in Ukraine during World War II, they killed a whole lot of innocent people. But to pull this back, there are these anti-Semitic elements in these parties. The first play, there was a warning that was issued by I think it was issued by some Israeli human rights organization, saying that it was like a warning to the Jews in the area that they may not be safe in Ukraine. And there was a play that was allegedly on a New Year's Day. I think it was New Year's Day in 2015. There was this play that didn't really catch attention, but it was on the main stage of the Euromaidan. And it was like an anti-Semitic play about the birth of Jesus. And it combined the Ukrainian contemporary politics with, like the elements of like a passion play. And it was
what they just like they went like full Mel Gibson on it? Like,
yeah, kind of. So it was called the Zid, or it was the Zid.
I remember this. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
And you can leave up. The Zid is an anti-Semitic slur, and it's about this guy who is like selling off the state-run assets, and the guy happens to be like a stock market speculator and a talk show host, and he is bribing Yanukovych, and then there's King Herod is in the play. It's a really bizarre thing. So there are these elements that are there that should raise immediate red flags. There's a play, and I don't think there's any way to look at a swastika and not see that as a incredibly anti-Semitic symbol.
Yeah.
Like some symbols are just so poisoned that there's no excuse to be seen and to wear them or to represent them. So
here's where I'm stuck on this particular thing. So, especially after looking at some of the evidence that this Canadian professor put out, like, it seems to me pretty clear that the far right in Ukraine did some fucked up shit, took advantage of a protest, and whether or not the implications of that directly resulted in the coup, I'm still uncertain about. And I think the reason I'm still uncertain about this is because it's elevating the significance of these Nazis and diminishing the significance of the non-Nazi majority that were generally pissed off at the Ukrainian government. You know what I mean? It almost, a lot of the arguments that I hear for or against the situation in Ukraine right now are centered around either, Yanukovych was a puppet, we overthrew him, now we want to be a thing, and we don't want to be a vassal state to Russia. That's the one argument. And the second argument is like, oh no, that's a bunch of Nazis took over the Ukrainian government, and that's not a thing. It's not real. I feel like it's just ignoring some of the realities here. And I keep coming back to this LGBTQ thing because this community is not a community of Nazis, right? And they were among the first people and some of the loudest proponents of the peaceful part of the protest, and for them specifically, they had their initiatives and their prerogatives where they wanted to join Europe, right? They felt Ukrainian, of course, but they wanted to join the greater European community, largely because they felt it was a better bet for them, in being able to live freely and without, persecution. And so this small group that was, important to the beginning of that protest had nothing to do with Nazis, had nothing to do with whether or not, Yanukovych was a Russian puppet or not. All they wanted was, their rights. And I think they get overlooked because it was, and at least it appears that this movement was co-opted by these super right-wing people. And, to the right sector's own admission, we might have only been 8%, but if we weren't there, 90% of this revolution wouldn't have happened. So it makes me think out loud, like, would they had the right sector not joined in militarily and aggressively, what kind of world would we live in? Would the voices of the Ukrainians who were already, pissed off at the state that had nothing to do with Nazis, would they have been able to exert change democratically, freely? It's kind of the question that I keep asking myself.
We don't know. We don't know that world, but I can tell you one thing, is that everyone is worse off right now from the events that happened from 2014 on. So it's listen, man, I wouldn't want to be part of. I'm an American citizen. I'm very happy to be an American citizen. I wouldn't want to be a citizen anywhere else in the world. If I was going to choose, if I had to be a citizen anywhere else, it would be a liberal democracy. Most likely either in Canada or Europe or Australia or wherever. It would not be Russia. It would not be Ukraine. It would not be pretty much anywhere in Eastern Europe. My heritage is Eastern European. I would not want, I wouldn't want to be a citizen there. I completely understand hating your government. Believe me. I understand hating your government more than most people. And wanting to get real change. Especially when you have on the corruption index, Ukraine is among the most corrupt countries in the world. There's a good reason to protest. There's a good reason to want to seek assimilation with the West. And there's good reason to want to distance yourself from Russia, because it's true, Russia does see Ukraine as their vassal or their right, they're kind of a block of territory that they have the right to use as a buffer and for their own geopolitical interest. And I understand that you resent that, but it becomes a complicated question because you're attached to a nation where a huge percentage of the people don't want to move in that direction. And you're forcing them to go along with a movement that they didn't sign up for. And it's just one of the problems with just the realities of just like a government. They have a monopoly of a violence, and sometimes those borders within the monopoly of violence don't all have the same agenda or don't have all the same priorities. And, there's this power struggle that develops to get that monopoly on violence. And sometimes it can get really nasty. What my take is, and I think you can share the take, is that the U.S. shouldn't be doing things to inflame possible violence and inflame the violence. And it seems that the West has done that, and it's we're living with the consequences. But it sucks. My friend was in Ukraine for a little bit, and he was telling me like, hey, I have a lot of friends in Ukraine. They're definitely not far right. They're they're from Kiev. They're like normal people who want to be like part of the West, and they want to be American. They would love to be American, but they don't have any money. They can't even immigrate. They literally don't have the means to immigrate from Ukraine. They're stuck there, and they're just kind of stuck in this horrible situation. And that sucks. That's horrible. But now we're talking about a situation that has developed into an international global crisis. And there's no complicated solution. It means like saying, no, we can't help you. Which is like a real sad thing. You feel it. You're like, man, sorry, we can't help. But there's just no easy answers.
I hear that, man. I think, and to be honest, for a lot of the folks, there's 4.5 million at this point that have fled Ukraine. So for the folks that really wanted to be a part of the West, they certainly could stick around now, I suppose. You know,
You get refugee status.
yeah,
But a lot of it is more anti-Russian geared. And there's been.
I mean, I think you bring up a really good point, with this Maidan, because, as we outlined in the beginning, the western part of Ukraine was culturally more aligned with the West, and the eastern part of Ukraine was culturally more aligned with Russia. And so I don't actually know what the demographics of the Euromaidan was, generally speaking, in terms of its like what proportion of people from the West versus what proportion of the people from the East were there. But my suspicion is that fewer people from the East were involved. I'm sure they were pissed off at the Ukrainian government, but just for different reasons,
Well, I mean, Crimea was an example of a region of the country that was about 90% against the Maidan protest. Mm-hmm. Eastern, the Donbass region, against the Maidan protest. Even Odessa, there was a big movement against the Maidan protest. A lot of the parts of the southeast were against the Maidan protest. Mm-hmm. So,
and that's before
they felt
the
that the Maidan protest was an actual anti-Russian movement, and that the Russian was going to turn around, and the new government was going to turn around and hurt them,
persecute them,
and they were true. That was actually true. Like, after that, the Euromaidan government came in. They did pursue hostile policies towards the Russian population. They outlawed the Russian language, and even Ukrainian, like pro-Ukrainian people will tell you that was a really dumb thing to do by the Poroshenko government, was to outlaw Russian. So it's.
I mean, it makes me think about it again,
gripe
because,
too.
That's so true. And again, I wonder if these folks that were originally protesting, this protest was 100% co-opted by, the far right. They increased their political stature by creating a violent event, and they're the ones that ended up coming in power, and their main motivations were to kill Russians.
But then there's another contradiction in that too, because Zelensky's voted in 2019, and he runs on a pro-peace platform.
Right.
The Minsk 2 is a pro-peace platform that really sought to make peace with the eastern part of the country, to implement autonomy for them to not pull the country further into war. And Zelensky ran into a situation where he was, believe he was threatened by the far right, because Poroshenko, when he was taking in a easier line, he was threatened by the far right in Ukraine. So I think he was like, man, these people are going to try to kill me if I am seen to be capitulating at all.
And today we kind of see the same thing, even just outside of the far right. It's like capitulating to any kind of peace deal here would be seen as capitulation, putting Zelensky in kind of an awkward position as well. So, really, if you're gonna place any negative thoughts, this is going to be against this far right, aspect of the Ukrainian people. This right sector.
Well, there's blame for everyone. I mean, there's a lot of blame for Russia. There's a lot of blame for the EU. There's a lot of blame for Washington. There's a lot of blame for the right sector.
Right.
There's a lot of blame there's a lot of blame to go around, and
this is all on the shoulders of the regular Ukrainian people.
Yeah, it's all on the shoulders of regular people, and
yep,
it's. The country is destroyed. That's where we are at. Where the country, John Mearsheimer's prediction, where the country was going to get wrecked, absolutely happened, and now it's like a matter of kind of realizing what the policy was and what happened, and trying to find the solution where people don't die. Where the least amount of people get killed. as possible.
I mean, at this point, I think
wanna
the solution for that would be Donbass becomes its own thing. Just plain and simple. You know, like I don't see any other way around that. There's no way that there's a unification of Ukraine, in my opinion, to where it once was. I just don't see that as a thing.
It's certainly, I think that's true. All right. We've been podcasting for the past 4 hours.
Yeah.
It's time to, I think, end this thing.
Sounds good.
Thanks again for listening to another episode of Bro History. So again, this episode was recorded on April 10th. So it's probably being released later, either at least a week, much later. But we just wanted to make sure that we got an episode out if we were to miss a week. And we figured we'd just have a conversation about just some of the things that we've been reading about and looking into. And hopefully you found this interesting. If you want to support the show, rate and review the podcast. That is the number one way to support the show. You can rate us on Apple. You can rate us on Spotify. You can also join us on Patreon, where you get access to our Slack account. So join us there. And Danny, anything else you want to add?
No, man. All good for me.
All right. Peace, everyone.
Peace.